Transportation Committee Chair Deb Barber. It's Monday, April 26, 2021. Before I call the meeting to order, I'd like to say a few things about how we'll conduct this meeting. I want to acknowledge that COVID-19 is causing us to alter our usual procedures. As we know, Governor Walz has declared a peacetime emergency in response to COVID-19, and the Met Council has determined it's not practical or prudent to conduct an in-person committee meeting for reasons stated in the Governor's Emergency Executive Order. Accordingly, Met Council members will participate in this meeting by phone or other electronic means, and this Transportation Committee meeting will be conducted under Minnesota Statutes Section 13D.021. Before we start the meeting, we need to establish whether there is a quorum. With that, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss? Chambliss?
Aye.
Thank you. Cummings?
Here. Here.
Ferguson? Fredson?
Here.
Gonzalez? Sterner? I know I saw Sterner earlier. Zirin? And Barber.
Here. And yes, I do believe both Councilmember Sterner and Councilmember Zarin are on the call as well, but I think we're having some audio troubles today. Having a quorum present, I call to order the meeting of the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee for April 26, 2021. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. If nobody has any other changes or additions to the agenda, we can move ahead. All right, seeing and hearing none, the agenda is approved. Next, we're on to approval of the minutes from the April 12th, 2021 meeting. Did anyone have any changes or additions to the minutes? Seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Fredson, so moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Cummings seconds.
Seconded by Cummings. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss?
Aye.
Cummings?
Aye.
Ferguson? Fredson? Gonzalez? Sterner? Zirin? And Barber.
Aye. With that, the minutes are approved. And just noted in the chat that Councilmember Zarin votes aye as well. Next, we are on to our tab report from April 21st. We have Mr. Dugan here. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? I know some are having technical difficulties.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, the honorable members of the Transportation Committee, General Manager Koistra, and Director Thompson, and of course, Jenna, who does everything in the background. From the TAB meeting of last Wednesday, the Chair Hovland, informed us that the second round of COVID financing for the MPO, for your Met Council, is about $20 million, and the TAB will start a process of making decisions on the distribution of these funds in July. And at the last, and also at the TAB meeting, and if I may follow up at your last meeting on April the 12th, I believe, Cole Hineker presented the unique development process. And we began the Unique Work Project Group, began work last Friday, and we thank Chair Barber and Councilmember Fredson for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time to do so. The group will be meeting have six meetings, and there's about $4 million restricted funds in this category. One of the things we learned in the group session was that unique and innovative are not synonymous, and TAB will focus on outcomes from this funding, such as climate impact or social equity, rather than a unique definition of unique projects. From MnDOT, for your constituents, the website of 511mn.org, so 511, is the summer construction update website. Okay, MnDOT has begun its 20-year revision of its 20-year state multimodal program plan, and also MnSHIP, the state highway investment plan. Interestingly enough, again, for your constituents, MnDOT has been receiving requests for letters of support for congressional community projects. These are from a list designated as member-directed projects, also known as earmarks. The Transportation Economic Development Program, nicknamed TED, will open in May with $10 million for the solicitation. This is less than previous years. And DEED's TEDdy program will also open in that time period. That stands for Transportation Economic Development Program. And there are also grants will be available from the federal government's RAISE program. RAISE stands for Rebuilding America, Infrastructure, Sustainability, and Equity, formerly known as Tiger and Build grants. And the state received about $162 million from the second round, the December round of the CARES Act distribution. How that will be funded is, first of all, the legislature has to authorize MnDOT to use those funds. And it's my understanding that the MnDOT commissioner, in consultation with your council, counties and cities, has made 5 recommendations. 1, the money goes to what is legally obligated to the Met Council. Secondly, the same amount to the ATPs, the Area Transit Partnerships, which replicate smaller MPOs, bridges and roadways, federal projects with funding gaps, and a large mobility project. On the MPCA report, the the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they have prepared a very impressive fact sheet on the VW settlement, which Jenna has and can send to you if you would like. Generally, from a high viewpoint, 12 million of the $40 million has been spent. 140 new school buses, and this is some detail, but again, if you're asked, 124 large trucks, some electric, 6 new heavy-duty electrical vehicles, 24 off-road equipment, 24 off-road equipment vehicles, and 22 fast chargers, 25 level 2, 1,100 miles of highway have been covered with a goal of 2,500 miles. And the phase 2 is 2020 to 2023, and the remaining 23.5 million will be spent. The goal is to reduce nitrogen oxides, fine particulate pollution, and greenhouse gases. Nitrogen oxides are from the ozone, and they are particulate matter that cause haze and acid rain. Fine particulate pollution are tiny particles of dirt, dust, soot, smoke, created during gas combustion and are harmful to the lungs. And if you allow me, greenhouse gases are what are naturally caused, naturally occurring, and allow the sun's rays to pass through and warm the earth without escaping the atmosphere into space. However, greenhouse gas is also a gas that absorbs and emits radiant energy into what is called the thermal infrared range, causing the overheating greenhouse effect. Again, for your constituents, there is a provision that any organization installing an electric vehicle charger must maintain it. And there is a website called PlugShare, which Jenna has, www.plugshare.com, which allows reporting on the maintenance of charging station. It also includes a map so you can find the one closest to you and comment on your experience. The MAC report is upbeat. Air traffic is up 50% from 2009. In 2020 was only up 15%. So far in April, we're averaging 243 daily flights, up from 235 in March. In an not an unusual trend, but an emerging trend of private plane transportation, reliever airports have seen an increase of 10% over pre-COVID levels. Delta flies May 5th to Mexico City, Southwest in June 5th daily to Austin, and JetBlue to the Caribbean. And again, if I may say for your constituents, the state of Minnesota is still operating a testing site at the airport on the Blue Ramp. It is free and open to the public. Test results in 24 to 48 hours, no boarding pass required. However, for airline passengers on Concourse F, there is a testing site with 30-minute test results sent by text. It meets all international and domestic destination requirements. For appointments, you can go on the MSP website or to the vendor, which is called Wander, as in wandering, Wander test. And the MAC emphasize that testing is not dependent on is dependent solely on the airline and destination, not MSP, and the FAA is reluctant to impose uniform regulations. For the safety of the airport, 5,200 employees have been vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson. Now that that's been suspended, they're going back into Moderna. And if I may, Madam Chair, I would like to update your committee on Ms. Johi Plum's presentation on equity in transportation. Ms. Plum is the executive director of the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability, known as the Alliance, whose mission is to add, since 1994, it's been in existence, and its mission is to advance justice and equity in economic and land development, and at the shared power intersections of racial justice, economic, environmental, and health equity. One of the things she pointed out right from the get-go was equity and equality are not the same. Equity is not another name for equality. Equity is not a synonym for diversity or inclusion, and it is not a euphemism for people of color. As to what equity can be, Ms. Plum did a hypothetical example of an LRT station area where the principles of equity as defined by the Alliance would apply, such as human rights, the benefits are accessible to everyone, human-centered, the community drives and defines the project, centered in communities historically harmed, intersectional, by this she means patterns of oppression that are interrelated and bound together, such as gender, race, immigration, language. And it also shifts power to the community. And the two final aspects are reparative and regenerative. Reparative is to learn from history and repair the harm. Regenerative is to make investments that strengthen the community today and tomorrow. Lastly, her agency or her organization has an equity scorecard, and as it applies to transportation, it is principles or local visions of the measurable benefits, community decision power, inclusive design, safe, accessible, and functioning, and priority and connectivity for the elderly, those with disabilities, those without cars or unable to get driver's license. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I see that Charles Carlson is on, and if we want to do another session on the AVRT, which I know you've seen, Mr. Carlson was kind enough to do so. And I don't know, is General Manager Koistra on in today? I don't think so.
Yes, he is.
Oh, he is. I'm sorry, General Manager. If I may, on a personal level, I wanted to congratulate you, your team, particularly the Metropolitan, the Transit Police under Chief Frizzell, for doing an outstanding job, working with downtown and all the effects of the last weeks. So hats off to you, sir.
Thank you, and I'll pass that on to the people who deserve the compliment.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeGan. Any questions from council members or comments? Sorry, but my cat is quite persistent in wanting to join this meeting, so my apologies. So she wants to hog the limelight. So, so thank you very much, Peter. Next, we're on to reports. We've got MTS Director Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. The motor vehicle sales tax quarterly report was recently released internally at the council. As you recall, MVES is one of our key funding sources for transit operations. The first quarter of 2021, the report was very positive. MVES receipts were at 112% of what we forecast what was forecast in November 2020. And the November forecast is what the council uses for adopting its budget. So the key source of funding for us, MVES, is trending higher than our forecast, which is a good sign for this year. And I'll continue to update as we get quarterly reports. At the legislature, since we last met, both the House and the Senate passed their omnibus transportation bills. The two bills are significantly different, and so they'll be going into conference committee, which should be named fairly soon. they have not named the members of that conference committee yet, but that process will start, and hopefully they'll wrap up when the session ends. On the COVID front, our contractor workforce has had 3 positive occurrences of COVID in the testing since we last met. That marks a total of 155 in the workforce that have tested positive for COVID since we began testing. But of the 155, 151 have already returned to work. So positive trends there. In terms of service, Metro Mobility ridership growth is starting to actually accelerate. We are now above 60% of our pre-COVID levels for the first time since COVID started. Our healthcare essential worker trips remain very strong at about 50% of their peak levels. Transit link service, though, is not following the same trend line. It has not experienced growth recently. It's been pretty flat ridership since January, and that transit link service is operating at about 50% of COVID levels. However, we are using Transit Link as the main provider of food delivery from the food shelves. So contractors are still remaining very busy with that service. As we mentioned last time, along with Metro Transit, we are offering free rides to Metro Mobility customers who have signed up to receive the COVID vaccine at the Minnesota State Fair FEMA vaccination site. This past Friday, originally that site was for a certain number of zip codes. This past Friday, the state expanded the eligibility for anybody with disabilities to the basically 7-county region to use the State Fair site. So we're expanding our Metro Mobility free rides to any of the Metro Mobility customers who get an appointment at that site, and not just to the limited zip codes that were originally launched. And in closing, at that State Fair location, we're really making it convenient working with the Department of Health and the site. The customers on Metro Mobility arrive, they have their own lane for getting the vaccine. Provider of the vaccine goes on the bus and provides the vaccine, so the customer does not have to get off the bus and wait. And then we just wait with the bus for the standard 15 minutes to make sure they're okay, and then they will return customer back home or to back where they wanted to go. So it's really working slick at that site, and hopefully we're getting more customers now that it has expanded at that location. With that, Madam Chair, that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Director Thompson. Are there any questions or comments from council members? All right, thank you. Seeing none, we're on to General Manager Koistra.
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, I want to start with my acknowledgement of the FDA approval of Gold Line to move into engineering phase of the New Starts program. And I want to congratulate the hard work of our BRT staff, working closely with Ramsey and Washington County staff in reaching this milestone. It's a big deal for the project, and everybody's really happy that it came through with a medium-high rating and is now part of the New Starts program. Yes, and then there are a couple of Gold Line business items on the agenda today, and we're planning a Gold Line update information item for an upcoming transportation meeting. So more to come on the status of Gold Line. I'll also mention that we have had, on the COVID side, we've had now 413 employees who've tested positive for COVID since the start of the pandemic. Since last Transportation Committee meeting on April 12th, we've had 12 employees test positive. We continue to monitor locations by site, and we're not seeing any hotspots or patterns with respect to transmission of the virus. Also related to the COVID vaccination efforts, the mobile vaccination buses were highlighted by the governor's office last week during a press event that Chair Zelli participated in. And as I've mentioned before, the mobile vaccination buses are a partnership with MDH to reach communities that are underserved and face barriers to other vaccination options. The first locations are within the Twin Cities region, and then I believe later there are plans to move to outstate locations. The first buses are in service, and we're working to expand the fleet and reach in the reach of this effort, and we'll have 6 buses by next month. And I want to recognize in this context Metro Transit bus operators and supervisors who've stepped up to work these assignments, as well as the maintenance staff who've worked closely with MDH to design and build build the buses that are being used for this effort. Really appreciate everyone's eagerness and willingness to take part in this important work. And then finally, it was previously mentioned by Peter, we all know the Chauvin trial concluded with 3 guilty verdicts last Tuesday. Metro Transit Police operations and facilities and maintenance were prepared for any outcome prior to the verdict, and out of an abundance of caution, we relocated Nicollet Bus Garage operations to our South Garage facility, given its proximity to the Minneapolis Police Department's 5th Precinct. Metro Transit staff were present in the Unified Command Center 24/7 so that our employees and customers would have the latest information for more than 10 days leading up to the verdict. And I just want to thank everyone for their preparation and planning. The bus and train operations were maintained during the entire trial, and there were no major issues to report with respect to bus and train service. And so again, my thanks go to both to the the Metro Transit Police Department, the operations staff, and the facilities and maintenance staff for their hard work in preparing for the effort. And of course, really happy that it resulted in a peaceful outcome. With that, I'll take questions.
Thank you, General Manager. Are there questions from council members? Comments? All right. Seeing none, thank you, Wes. Now we're on to our business items. We have no items on consent tonight, but our first business item is business item 2021-87, a same week item. It's about the travel behavior inventory. We have Jonathan Ehrlich and Ashley Asmus here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. The Travel Behavior Inventory Transit Onboard Survey is conducted approximately every 5 years. It provides data necessary to assist with regional travel modeling, transit planning, and market research, while also satisfying FTA requirements. As in past surveys, riders from all fixed route routes and all providers will be surveyed. We expect to gather information about origin destination patterns and demographics from approximately 26,000 riders. New for this survey, while the major survey work is being conducted in 2022, a pilot test will occur in 2021 that, in addition to testing sampling methods and materials, will also provide information on pandemic-era ridership patterns. This survey will also be expanded to include weekend ridership for the first time. For this survey, an RFP was issued on January 11th, 2021, and 2 proposals were received and reviewed. The evaluation committee recommended that ETC Institute be awarded the contract to conduct the onboard survey. The evaluation committee agreed that this proposal represents a best value to the council. The winning proposal also exceeds the DBE goal of 14%. There are 2 parts of the requested action. The first authorizes a subordinate funding agreement with MnDOT to transfer federal funds for this project, and the second allows for the negotiation and execution of the consultant contract itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from council members? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the business item.
Motion to approve.
Moved by Chambliss. Is there a second?
Second by Sterner.
Seconded by Sterner. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez, Sterner,
Aye.
Zirin, and Barber.
Zirin's an aye.
Thank you.
And Barbara's an aye. Very good. And that motion carries. Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we're on to business item 2021-998. That's Blue Line Enhancements Phase 2A Special Track Work. And we have Ryan Heath here to present.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Business item 2021. Can you hear me?
We can now. Yeah, it was a little quiet at first, but I can hear you now.
I apologize. Business item 2021-98 is for the production of special trackwork components for the Blue Line Enhancements Phase 2A project. Blue Line Enhancements is a phased rehabilitation and upgrade of the existing Blue Line light rail line. Phase 2A will rehabilitate worn track components and outdated signal components between the Mall of America station and the BCS station in Bloomington. This contract is for the production of special trackwork components for the Mall of America interlocking and the 28th Avenue interlocking. The components have a long lead time and require a separate procurement to maintain the project schedule. 2 bids were received that range from $777,690 to $2,339,425. Progress Rail Services Corporation was the lowest responsible bidder and is recommended for award. The proposed action is that the Metropolitan Council authorize award and execution of contract 20P315 with Progress Rail Services Corporation for the production of special trackwork components for the Blue Line Enhancements Phase 2A project in the amount not to exceed $777,690. With that, I am now open for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Are there questions from council members? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm always questioning on these and always concerned about the big gap between the bids that were received, and if you have any idea of what's causing that from 777 to over 2 million.
We were also interested in that gap. Progress Rail is a responsive bidder. They have produced special track work for the council multiple times, including for the Southwest LRT project. They were available their differences, and we can.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, your audio went out there. I'm sorry.
Oh, I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on with it today. Progress Rail was consistently lower than the other bidder. And after the review with procurement, we feel confident that Progress is responsive and responsible and will be able to produce the components required.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you. I'm just curious again, this seems to have happened a few times on different issues where we've had these huge spreads and only 2 bids. Do we ever go back and try and figure out or talk to the high bidder? Or I realize it's the lowest responsible bidder and that's what we're going to accept, and that's great. But I think we don't ever want to get in a position where one bid is 2,339,000 and one is 2,310,000. So, you know, when there's such a huge discrepancy and it's based on the same set of standards for the bid, do we ever look a little bit deeper, or do we just accept that bid and move forward?
If possible, can I pass this off to Laura regarding our procurement procedures for following up with bidders?
Of course. Welcome, Laura.
Hello, Chair, members. So I caught the majority of the conversation, and it sounds like the question was around the discrepancy in the 2 bids. And we are seeing this a lot more in our procurements, the volatility of the market. I don't know if it's due to COVID and other factors, but we are seeing this. And to answer the question directly, does procurement go back and investigate? We will investigate. I don't know if we have on this one, but we certainly can look into it. But it is not anything that we aren't seeing more of and an uptick in procurement. And it may be even possible that the highest bidder knew that they were well above what the market rate would come in at. And there's a chance that the lowest one might not be responsive. You know, so it could be a business decision as well as to why their bid isn't as competitive. But it definitely is something that we're seeing more common in the procurements that are being submitted. And, also in terms of a check, we would use the independent cost estimate as well that the project manager and the business unit produced in order to compare to see what is an actual competitive price. And it's clear that the 2 million was well above the cost estimate.
Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you. That's helpful. Again, I just to reiterate my concern, if we had basically $2 million bids, and in fact the work could be done for 777,000 or a third of that high bid. I just want to make sure that if we're getting an independent estimate on what the work should cost, then that certainly is helpful. But it's just concerning, and I realize too that the volatility of the market is such that both with labor and materials, people are hedging their bets. But so your explanations are helpful. I appreciate that. It's just wild to see these swings, and again, we've seen a few of them come through, and it's kind of alarming. But thank you for your explanation. I understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I'm glad that there was a reasonable bid.
Yeah, yes, Madam Chair, members, I'll also add that we are looking at different ways to advertise these to reach the market, because if we only have 2, then we can maybe look to exploring how do we get more. So we are in active conversations with our business units to get help with that and to collaborate in order to get more bids and proposals.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also note that Councilmember Zara has put a couple comments in the chat box, basically flagging that this work is very specialized and some contractors are really worried about rising costs in this current market. But he did have one question. He wanted to know, were there any steel products in this bid?
Yes, the majority of the material is in fact steel, and the volatility of the steel market may be a factor in this particular procurement.
Perfect. Thank you, Ryan. Are there any other questions from council members? Councilmember Ferguson.
Do we at some point have concerns about collusion, or are there ways of, if there's some part of the bid that's highly volatile and so that's causing people to not be willing to bid, that we can take that out of the mix so that it's, so for example, if it's steel prices, that we could, the bid could be adjusted based on current steel prices or something along those lines to make people, make more people be willing to bid. So really kind of 2 questions, because I agree with Councilmember Cummings that this seems to be happening more and more, which, just makes you curious why it keeps happening on contracts, where we're seeing these huge gaps.
If I may put Laura on the spot again, since she has a broader view of our various procurements, to answer that question.
Of course. Go ahead, Laura.
Madam Chair, members, we're always in procurement looking for different ideas, and this may be an area where we do get in touch with some of our friends and other agencies and ask them what they're doing, because if we're seeing it at the council, then I have a feeling that others are seeing it as well. And what language can we build into our procurements? We're constantly looking to improve and get more competition, and to the extent that we would absolutely be open to any ideas, and we can explore that.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2021-98.
Cummings moves approval.
Moved by Cummings. Is there a second?
Seconded by Ferguson.
Seconded by Ferguson. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez, Sterner,
Aye.
Zirin,
Zaren's an aye.
Barber.
Aye. With that, the motion carries. Next, we are on to business item 2021-100. It's Gold Line contract for property acquisition legal services. And I believe we've got, I see Charles Carlson just came on camera, so, and Joe Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Charles Carlson, Director of Bus Rapid Transit Projects. I'm filling in today for Gold Line Project Director Chris Beckwith, who could not join us this afternoon. But it's my pleasure to echo the comments that Wes made early in the meeting, that the Gold Line has reached a significant milestone in entering New Starts Engineering. Really a celebratory event for us, as well as an affirmation by the FTA of this project's prospects, both in terms of project rating and confidence in the project's scope, schedule, budget, and delivery methods. So very happy about that and eager to share more about that as we bring back an information item in weeks ahead. But tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Klein, who is a planner in our BRT projects department, working on the Gold Line in the Gold Line project office. Joe serves as a planner and joined us about 5 years ago, first as an intern with Metro Transit Service Development, and then has moved and supported us in BRT projects. Joe takes on a number of different roles within our project office, and we're happy to have him here tonight to actually present his first business item before the committee.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. Just want to confirm first off that you all are able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, this business item is related to contract 20P073 to authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute 2 contracts for property acquisition legal services for the Gold Line project. They would be in a total amount not to exceed $971,556, and the allocation between those 2 contracts is listed in the business item. We are ramping up right-of-way acquisition activities in the Gold Line project office as we target for a construction date beginning in 2022. And for that work, similar to previous transitway projects, we are seeking the services of qualified legal services consultants to assist in the acquisition of privately owned properties in the corridor. Approximately 163 parcels within the corridor have been identified to be needed for the project. The vast majority of these are just for temporary easements for construction and are typically valued at less than $10,000. And I would note that out of those roughly 163, 2 of them will require relocation of personal property and commercial uses. There are no residential relocations identified with the project. The work that we were seeking in this contract, as I mentioned, is to represent the council in acquisition of privately owned parcels. That work will likely vary from parcel to parcel as we within the project office attempt to settle with them prior to that process beginning. But that work may include, but would not be limited to, initiating condemnation proceedings, settlement negotiations, hearings, appeals, and any other related activities. We issued an RFP for this work on November 12th, 2020, with the intention to award up to 6 contracts. And the reason for that is that when we developed the RFP, we grouped the 163 parcels into 6 separate groups, paired together by similarity of either geography or tenant makeup or land use to better match the various requirements and needs for different parcels with the anticipated with the procurement that would be beginning. We received 6 proposals and completed an evaluation panel between members of the project office, the real estate office, and Office of General Counsel, and are recommending awarding contracts to J. Selmer Law and Lavander, Gillen, and Miller. J. Selmer would be awarded what we consider to be groups 1 and 2, and those are for all the residential properties within Ramsey County. Lavander, Gillen, and Miller would receive groups 3 to 6, and that includes all commercial properties along the corridor, as well as residential within Washington County. The Office of Equal Opportunity assigned a DBE goal to this procurement of 1% and determined that both firms either met or surpassed that goal. J. Selmer Law included in their proposal a partnership with a DBE certified law firm, Zaylor Stout and Associates, and they will be assisting with negotiations. And the other, Levander, Gillen, and Miller, included in their proposal a subcontractor guaranteed title to do title work on the project. I would note that out of the there were 4 other bidders that were not recommended for award. 2 of those did not meet DBE goals. That was one of the partial reasons for not recommending them for award. The other 2 did include DBE goals as well, but we're very appreciative of the efforts both Jay Summer and Levander, Gillen, and Miller made to meet and to surpass the goal that we set on this project. And with that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to entertain any questions from committee members.
Great, thank you, Joe. Are there questions from council members? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious, 1% DBE goal seems very low. Can you explain how that was established? And then my second question is just, is 6 about as many bid as you would have expected for this type of work?
Yes, Madam Chair, committee members, I can speak to the 1% DBE goal to start. We had a lot of discussions back and forth when we were initiating this procurement with OGC and OEO and the project office to make sure that we could set a goal that was achievable and would also hold true to the council's efforts to award work to disadvantaged business enterprises. The reason for that came out of several factors, one of them being that since it is it's very difficult to actually tell out how much work would be identified by parcel without the process actually beginning. The amounts that we're working off of the independent cost estimate and these contract awards are based off of our assumptions for how many parcels would go to condemnation, which are subject to change and could impact whether or not an award would be met, or a goal would be met, excuse me. And the other is that when we were developing the scope of work for this procurement, there were very limited opportunities to subcontract work out. I would note that the one firm that was recommended for award and included title updates in their scope. That is work, typically we see some firms that submit bids of that in-house and as part of the prime contractor. But given that the nature of this work was one, could be quite in flux from parcel to parcel and along the alignment, as well as just generally not many opportunities to subcontract, led to that goal being set. We did do some reach out to DBE law firms and potential bidders prior to this. And as far as the question about whether or not the 6 bids that came in were pretty typical, I will just caveat and admit this would be my first time leading a legal services procurement through, so I wouldn't be able to speak to my own personal experience from others. But in reviewing the bids that we received, we were quite satisfied with the quality and the qualifications that they provided, and it gave us quite a lot of a breadth of proposals to review and choose from. Hope I've answered your questions.
Thank you.
All right, additional questions or comments from council members? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item number 2021-100.
Sterner motions approval of the item.
Moved by Sterner, is there a second?
Fredson, I'll second.
Seconded by Fredson, is there any other discussion? All right, seeing and hearing none, Jenna, could you call the roll, please?
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Ferguson,
Aye.
Fredson,
Aye.
Gonzalez, Sterner,
Aye.
Zirin,
Aye. Zirin's
Barber.
aye.
And Barbara is an aye. With that, the motion carries. So thank you, Joe and Charles. That ends our business for the evening. I would say that the first item is a same week item, so it'll go non-consent to the full council, but I would recommend that items 2 and 3 go on the consent agenda. Everyone agrees with that? All right, sounds good. All right, we're on to our first information item, and it's our TMA certification review findings, and we have Amy Vennewitz here.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Amy Vennewitz with MTS. Here to give a short overview of our recent federal MPO planning certification review. Is my sound working fine for everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. Next slide, please, Greg. So as a federally designated MPO, we undergo a review of our planning processes and the federally required documents that we produce every 4 years. Generally, our federal partners are trying to determine if our programs are both cooperative and inclusive, and that we meet all of the federal planning requirements that are specified in federal law, though they can also go beyond that and just give us kind of general recommendations for improving our processes. The focus typically is on our big documents such as the Transportation Policy Plan, TIP, and Unified Planning Work Program. But as I said, they do delve into other federal planning requirements too. Next slide, please. And I forgot to mention the federal review is required and is accomplished every 4 years. So the review took place last December and typically is attended by MTS, a number of our MTS planning staff, also community development staff, along with MnDOT and Metro Transit, along with our Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration reviewers. It's our local reviewers from the local FHWA office, our Region 5 FTA partners, and then also specialty offices from Washington, D.C. USDOT. So in the past, these reviews were pretty long and involved and would take place over 2.5 to 3 days. The feds are really trying to shorten up the time and effort that they put into these reviews and are just recently doing a pilot program where they focus on specified areas for the review. So ahead of the review, they sent us questions that they wanted to focus on, and we were able to both answer those questions in writing and then delve into the questions in more detail in the actual sessions. And the sessions took place over 2 half-days sessions rather than 2.5 days. The potential outcomes of the review are that they can give us commendations in areas of the work where they think we are excelling. They can give us recommendations for improvement, and they can also give us corrective actions, which we would be required to take. I'm happy to say we did not receive any corrective actions, and in the history of these reviews have never received a corrective action in our region. We did receive 4 commendations and 12 recommendations for improvement, and I will go over those quickly in the next slide, please, Craig. So the commendations were in 4 different areas. First, they were very impressed with our transportation policy plan and transportation improvement program public comment and review and response process. If you would remember, we had both of those processes during the COVID event. For the TPP, we received over 400 comments. For the TIP, over 200 comments. And we do respond to each and every comment that we receive. We compile them into a summary and then produce a final report. But they were very impressed both with the level of response that we got and the detailed comments that we went into in our response process. And I do want to recognize our communications office, specifically Sarah Maskey, who spent a lot of time and effort putting together those public comment reports last year. And it was really quite a nice production for both of them. We also received commendations for our household travel behavior inventory survey and data analysis, and also our special COVID-19 travel survey, which we quickly implemented and were able to get in place over the course of the year. Last year, 3 different surveys, and you have seen information items on both those pieces of work. I think it's fairly unique across the country, both those activities, and again, kind of a national best practice. And I would like to recognize Jonathan Ehrlich, who was on earlier today in this committee meeting, and his team, who really went above and beyond and continue to go above and beyond with the TBI in particular. So really nice pieces of work. And then the fourth area that we received a commendation was our regional bicycle transportation planning work. Specifically, over the past maybe 6 years or so, we have been creating and funding through the regional solicitation a regional bicycle transportation network, otherwise known as the RBTN. And then in the past 2 years, we went a step beyond that and identified regional bike barriers and are beginning a process of funding projects to remove those barriers to bicycle transportation. That work is led by Cole Hineker and Steve Elmer as our lead bicycle planner. So I do want to recognize them for really outstanding work in those areas too. Next slide, please, Greg. So in the area of recommendations, we did receive, as I indicated, 12 recommendations focused in 4 different areas. I would not label any of these recommendations particularly large or concerning, so that's good news. First of all, I will start in the area of our Unified Planning Work Program. We had 3 recommendations in that area, kind of what I would label administrative recommendations. First, that we clarify the source and use of funds that we use for overmatching our planning funds. We do typically overmatch. We are required to provide a 20% match, but in recent years have been going up around 30 to even over that as a percent match. And they just want us to be clear where those funds are coming from and how we spend the overmatch funds. They recommended that we provide consistency in how we name our planning studies across our documents. Typically, we have planning studies that appear in the TPP and then move into funding and implementation in our UPWP, and oftentimes the terminology and the title of the work changes, and they just kind of find that confusing. And then they recommended that we improve our cost estimates. Again, this is for projects not in the bidding phase, but when we estimate projects from the TPP and then into the UPWP, and then when we finally go into the actual contracting phase, oftentimes those estimates can change based on where we think the scope of work is currently. In the area of transit planning, we had 4 different recommendations. The first is that we improve coordination with all regional transit providers and that we form a regional transit providers working group that can meet regularly and discuss transit planning issues that are taking place within the region. Secondly, that we execute an agreement with the transit providers establishing the roles and responsibilities of the various entities within the transit planning process. That we provide links to transit providers on the council website and adequately recognize all of the regional transit providers. And finally, that we clarify how federal formula funds are distributed and among the regional transit providers, and that we include language in the Transportation Improvement Program describing how we distribute our federal formula funds. Next slide, please, Greg. A couple other areas of recommendations in the area of our transportation public participation. We do have what is known as a federally required transportation public participation plan. This plan is different from the council's overall public participation and engagement plan, and specifically deals with how we will do public engagement around our transportation requirements and our required documents. So that they recommended that we include evaluation metrics in our transportation public participation plan and evaluate our activities on an ongoing basis. They recommended that we update the plan to include specific strategies related to tribal consultation, which we are doing. We just do not have it specifically called out in our current version of the public participation plan. And finally, that we identify an update cycle for the public participation plan. We have not done that yet. It likely will be on a 5-year schedule, similar to updating the transportation policy plan. And then the final recommendation was in the area of environmental mitigation. They recommended that we provide more detailed discussion, specifically in the transportation policy plan, on strategies that the region uses to mitigate transportation's impact on the environment and on cultural resources, and that we just provide a lot more detail on how that takes place across the various transportation agencies within the region. Next slide, please, Greg. So as I indicated, we were very appreciative and also proud of the work that they called out in the commendations. Generally, we agree with the recommendations for improvement that they provided with us, and we think most of that work can get done pretty quickly and have already assigned staff to begin working on it. The recommendations for the UPWP will be accomplished with the next version of the UPWP, the 2022 UPWP, which will be in front of you for adoption next fall. We will be forming a transit work group and have already begun meeting individually with the regional transit providers to get an idea of their interest and what they want this group to focus on. And then the whole group will begin meeting in June. And by the end of the year, we will have an agreement describing the roles and responsibilities of the transit providers within the regional planning process. The Transportation Public Participation Plan changes and update we feel we can accomplish by early 2022, and then we will likely already be using many of the strategies that are being updated within that plan. And then finally, the environmental mitigation discussion, because that was specific to the transportation policy plan, we won't accomplish that until the next update of the TPP, which will occur in 2024. But we do think this is an opportunity to really up our role in thinking about environmental mitigation. We will have discussions with community development specifically, and also our other partner groups such as the DNR and MPCA, and are thinking that we will likely form an ongoing environmental mitigation and transportation working group to flesh out some of the activities and then specifically put them in the TPP in 2024. So that is a quick summary of the findings and our response, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Amy. Are there any questions from council members? Councilmember Chambers.
Thanks for all of the staff and for the presentation. Amy? I'm not sure where is that my speaker? Sorry about the noise. If anybody else has a question, I can try to change my headphones.
You sound better now.
Okay. So I just wanted to, I was glad to see what some of the recommendations were, particularly with regard to public participation and adding the metrics. I'm assuming that a part of that metrics will be an opportunity for us to include disaggregated data. And especially since we're spending so much money on the various inventories that are being utilized, it's important to take advantage of the capabilities of those inventories and add in the disaggregated data, which I know our council member Atlas Ingerbritton has mentioned on many occasions as well.
Yes, and I agree. I don't have Sarah Maskey. I don't think she's on here today. She'll be leading the update of our public participation strategies, and I'll definitely give her that feedback. And it might be that we need to have some separate discussions and meetings to really flesh out what we can and can't do in that area, but definitely could do it.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Cummings. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Amy, this is, clearly a huge project, and thank you for the report and for your work, and clearly calls on many, many, many staff members to participate in this. Congratulations on the commendations. That's always nice to receive. Just to call out, and I call this out often, and in my public service, I have discovered that it's pretty easy to kind of let replies to surveys or questions or emails from individuals to slide a little bit. So I'm really happy to hear that Sarah Maskey was able to reply individually to over 400 people in the survey. Again, I'm pleased that the Met Council takes that seriously, and hopefully we continue to do that in every area, because I firmly believe that anybody who participates, this is our outreach and engagement, and it's critically important that people feel that they are a part of the process and deserve acknowledgement, response, reply, whatever. So I'm really happy to hear that, and send my extra thanks for working on that. But all of this is amazing, and clearly a huge lot of work. So thank you for your leadership and then your report on this. Very informative.
All right, thank you. Additional questions or comments from council members? All right, I think just pass along to all of the team who worked on this of really, really good job. I mean, even just having no corrective actions, but having the commendations and all of that is really great. And I'm glad we also get some good constructive feedback, because we can always improve things. So very well done. So thank you, Amy.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. Next, we're on to our last information item, which is Metro Transit Service Equity Evaluation. We have Adam Harrington, Kristen Thompson, and Rachel Dunca here to present.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Welcome.
Wonderful. I'm here with Kristen Thompson, the Assistant Director of Service Development, and Rachel Dunca, the Manager of Strategy and Performance within the Strategic Initiatives Department. And with their great assistance, we have put together a service equity evaluation. Next slide, Greg. This has been an effort really at the direction of the General Manager to identify a reporting structure that we can evaluate our service in a report annually that reflects how we serve our communities and what the equity measures can be around that. So some of the questions that we look at in this report that we'll be doing annually is, how do we change our service in response to the pandemic? Hopefully that won't be annual. But this last year, it's certainly been a significant part of our service changes and the change of our traveling environment, and has had a big impact on our riders. Who rides and who lives near our service, knowing that most of our riders are those who live right near a bus stop, not necessarily park and riders. And then, of course, how do racial and ethnic groups experience our service, and maybe how do they experience it differently? How are we performing from a Title VI perspective. So there's a few different ways that we'll be presenting to you today. And I want to underscore that within service development, as we develop our service and evaluate options for improving service, we're always looking at it from a professional lens and from an equity lens on who our customers are and what neighborhoods we serve and how do we serve them. And this again is an attempt to really develop regular measures that are repeatable that we can use every year to track our progress. And then when we are complete with this report, we'll be evaluating other ways we might be able to evaluate our service from an equity lens standpoint. Next slide. So the last year, as we all know, has been a challenge in many ways due to COVID-19. And what we have done in service development and at Metro Transit is make adjustments to our service throughout the last year in response to the state of the COVID virus within the governor's executive orders, with state and industry guidance, and especially with the guidance of our healthcare providers and state health department. So we want to make sure that we're balancing the health and travel needs of our customers. And so you will have had seen essential trips only, and that's just most recently was relaxed. We have face coverings required on all of our service, and that stands today and will probably be that way for some time. But as we adjusted our service through the pandemic, we wanted to make sure that we are continuing to serve those corridors, those communities where people are most reliant on transit. Even from the beginning with the stay-at-home order, some people don't have the option of driving a car or staying at home to meet their everyday needs. And so we wanted to make sure that we are able to provide that service for those who need it. And so I'm going to transition to Kristen Thompson, who will talk a little bit more in detail about the service changes that we made. And then Rachel will talk about some of the equity measures that we put into place for this study in this report. Thank you. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Adam. So in mid-March of last year, changes started to happen very quickly in response to closures and other restrictions brought on by the pandemic. So from a transit perspective, first we discontinued overnight service and then quickly reduced our weekday schedules. Those weekday schedules were reduced to about 60% of what a normal weekday was, and we had about 60 routes suspended, mainly our commuter and express routes. So throughout the spring, we made additional adjustments responding to the needs that we were observing. For example, in April, we had onboard passengers introduced. In May, we were able to add larger buses on many of the local routes where we saw higher ridership. Next slide, please. We had 2 rounds of service changes in June, first with our normal June pick, where we brought back a slightly wider span of service on the bus side from about 5 a.m. to 1 a.m. And then on June 27th, we were able to improve LRT frequency back to 15 minutes and added local route trippers to the schedule. So those were on routes where we observed we needed additional service. In August, after the statewide mask mandate began, the onboard fare collection resumed and front door boarding resumed as well. In our September service changes, we spent much of the summer really reviewing where we thought service would be going for the fall, like were employers opening up, were schools coming back, a lot of unknowns having to do with fall schedules. So we did a lot of work to get to the point where we were, which was first of all improving LRT service back to about every 10 minutes throughout the day. And then on the local bus side, we improved to about 90 to 100% of our former weekday schedule. So really bringing those local routes where we still saw continued ridership back to previous service levels. These improvements meant we needed fewer supplemental trips in the schedules. Next slide, please. So the next few slides show geographically where the transit service was operated through a couple different snapshots. The dots you see represent the number of trips serving each stop on any given weekday. So the larger the dot, the more trips serve that stop. So this is our pre-COVID service levels. You can see a lot of service is really concentrated on our downtowns and primary corridors. You also see some larger dots out where we have major park and rides and a lot of express service pre-COVID. and then smaller dots in areas where we have sort of all day, baseline service. Next slide, please. You can really see by May of 2020 that we had kind of shrunk back our service quite a bit, really focusing in on those core areas where people were still riding, and you see many lines went away because those commuter and express routes were not operating. Next slide, please. And then in September, and that's about the service level where we are today, you can see those lines intensifying again as we added service back and brought a lot of these local routes up to their previous pre-COVID schedules. I want to note here, Adam mentioned we're going to be looking at equity in several ways throughout this presentation. The 3 maps you just saw, we included ACP 50s in a yellow background as reference. We know the council has been doing a lot of work to kind of add dimension to the geography of where people who have low income and racial minorities are living. And so we know we're kind of moving away from ACPs as a general rule, but it is one way we have looked at equity in the past, and it's helpful in a map like this to have that visual reference. Next slide, please. So the September service levels brought us up to about 80% of our pre-COVID operating budget, and that's where we are today. Kind of, we carried that level of service over the winter, and are heading into our June pick service changes with about the same level. So this is reflecting reduced market demand due to remote work, job loss, school closures. However, as Adam pointed out, when we have social distancing and restricted loads, we actually need to provide additional service capacity to continue to accommodate folks who are still riding. As I mentioned, we returned to weekday pre-COVID service levels on most of our core local bus routes. So we were really focusing on the highest ridership routes serving people relying on transit the most, and serving schools and colleges as they reopened. We've made blue and green line service adjustments many times, reacting to changing conditions and operator availability. Our commuter and express route network remains at June levels, but we're prepared to add capacity as demand increases. So most routes that had been suspended last March remain suspended, and that's about 55 routes today. Next slide, please. Here you can see, this is a way to look at our service as it compares to pre-COVID levels by route type. So just to walk you through one example, the bus rapid transit column on the far left, it's showing we are operating 100% of the trips in September 2020 as we did in September 2019 pre-COVID. As you move through the chart from left to right, you can see on all local route types and on LRT, we're operating around 90 or better % of our former service levels. It's really our commuter service where the demand has just plummeted due to remote office work, and that's the North Star commuter rail, and commuter and express routes are operating less than 50% of the trips that they did pre-COVID. Next slide. So this chart represents our ridership by route type throughout the pandemic. The red you can see is express bus. So that was one of the first things to drop in March of last year and has stayed down about 90 to 95% down from what it had been pre-COVID throughout the entire pandemic. You can see light rail and local bus both dropped somewhat less than express bus. Light rail is down about 70% initially and now has grown a little bit closer to about 60% below pre-COVID ridership. And then local bus has stayed the strongest, down about 60% initially, and still around 60% down from previous levels. Next slide. This map represents ridership by stop and station as of fall 2020. So similar to the service maps I showed before, the dots here represent the number of boardings per stop throughout our network as it's running today. And again, you can see we've maintained higher ridership in our downtown areas, key corridors where we have high frequency service, LRT stations, and other transfer points throughout the network. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so the decision making throughout this period had to be very quick and responsive to pandemic conditions. we're really focusing on capacity, on reliability, and on allowing people to make essential trips. So what we wanted to do as part of this exercise is to take a step back and really assess our changes to make sure that the results were equitable. So Rachel and the team from Strategic Initiatives have developed a number of metrics to help us understand the equity of how we've distributed service and how customers experience it. So I'll pass it off to Rachel now.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Adam. My name is Rachel Dunca, and as Kristen said, I work in the Strategic Initiatives Department, and our goal is to really support each of our groups as we try to make better decisions with data, and specifically in this case, disaggregate our performance by race. So we first start out with many of these efforts is grounding ourselves in who experiences the benefits of our system and who's riding, and to also compare that to who's living in our region. And that's a little bit different. Our riders are more likely to be Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and less likely to be white. As this kind of indication, this slide shows, our numbers are in the dots that are have color, and the gray dots are the regional demographics. This is taken from a survey that was on board our transit service back in pre-COVID. So I suspect it looks a little bit different now, but the same point is the same, is that who rides our service is definitely different than who lives in our region. Next slide, please. So one of some of the key questions we had to support service development is, how do different racial and ethnic groups experience our service? And we looked at this in a couple of ways, and many of these metrics that I'm going to talk through today demonstrate an evolution of how we've thought about disaggregating our performance by race. So this slide here, this plot shows you the number of trips available to residents living near a transit stop or station. And that is kind of an evolution of a slide that you saw earlier that showed a map with all of our trip and our counts, our service trips on a map, and we had the designated areas of ACP 50s. And this is looking at it a little bit differently in that, so we're drawing lines around where people can walk to service, which is, we're using 10-minute walk sheds, and we're looking at the demographics of people that live within that 10-minute walk, and looking at how many trips on average do folks have, and then we disaggregate that information by race. So you can see here that we wanted to ensure that, or wanted to look at, given the council's goal of having equity, or at least affirmative goal, that in this case, white residents living near transit do not have more trips at their stop. So if I look at this slide, it's showing me that there's on average of those living near a transit stop, there's 51 trips that pass by that stop or station. For white residents, and for Black, it's 59, for example. This information isn't too shocking given where our service is located and where our most frequent service is located, based on some land use, the existing land use and patterns in our region. But it's good information to understand. Next slide. So the next question might be, well, that's great that there's service provided along my in my neighborhood, but really we know that the high frequency service that's 15 minutes or better is the most likely to be able to replace many types of trips. So thinking beyond just the work commute trip. If someone has access to that high frequency service, they're more likely to use our service and also be able to replace maybe car trips or other types of other types of modes. So we wanted to also see if there's any racial disparities in access to that high frequency service. And we see actually that Black residents, for example, at 35% have twice the access to high frequency service compared to white residents. And again, these are residents just living within the 10-minute within a 10-minute walk of our service. So we're not looking at the entire region, we're looking at those living near our network. Next slide. Another aspect to supporting the service equity evaluation is not just looking at the amount of service, but the quality of the service. And we're using existing metrics to look at that and disaggregating by race. So for example, a common measure of service reliability is on-time performance. So the percent of trips that are within a reasonable time or are close to the scheduled departure time. So we find that it's kind of shockingly similar across different racial groups, the on-time performance of our service. So we see no evidence, for example, that Black, Indigenous, or people of color living near a time point, living near a stop, experience worse on-time performance in 2020 than white riders. I should mention that on all of these slides, the horizontal black line is the regional, the regional or the average for each performance metric. And I would also note that that isn't necessarily the goal, but that's just the performance average. So we may have a higher goal or lower goal in some cases here, but just showing a average baseline. Next slide. So specific to service, we can talk about service availability, service count, service quality, but one thing that is most aligned with our regional outcomes is we want to provide access to opportunity. And one way of thinking about that is job accessibility. So depending on where I live, it really has an influence on where I can, how quickly can I get to a certain number of jobs. And so we wanted to look at this disaggregated by race, but we first wanted to just remind ourselves of what does job accessibility look like in the region. And this map shows something that isn't too surprising. If I live in Minneapolis or St. Paul, I can access more jobs than, let's say, if I lived in Coon Rapids within 45 minutes on transit specifically. So one thing that I think is really positive to look when you look at this map is you can actually see the impacts of our investments. So you can see the green line, the blue line, and you can even see the A line with the clearly half-mile marker between the stops, and you can kind of see where there's higher accessibility because of that frequent service. So that's a good news story there and not too surprising. So the next slide helps us understand how is that disaggregated by race. So this one just shows that just for the regional average here, we see that it's slightly less than 100,000 jobs are available within a 45-minute journey on transit. And so then we're looking at that by disaggregating that by race. We see within a 45-minute, for example, journey on transit, Black residents do have more total jobs available. Again, this metric looks really different if we looked at, for example, if we were looking at job accessibility with a personal vehicle, that there may be differences there, but within transit specifically, we don't see any sort of negative disparities with job accessibility. That's, I think, next slide. That's, yeah, that kind of concludes my portion of this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'll just add before I talk a little bit about the Title VI analysis that we also have information from the Transit Rider Survey, which comes from the TBI, which you heard about earlier today. And it's really helpful to understand that while a lot of what you're seeing today is based on where people live, sometimes where people want to go doesn't necessarily reflect the demographics of the community they live in, but it doesn't mean that that trip isn't as valuable or important. So we're looking at new data sources as well to help us moderate how we evaluate from an equity standpoint. The last topic we want to cover is the Title VI analysis, and this is a federal law that says that there shall be no discrimination of minority or low-income populations, and in particular, no disparate impact as it relates to the deployment of service or service changes. The Met Council has a policy in alignment with the FTA that reviews our system every 3 years and looks at an analysis of this type every time we have a major service change, meaning 25% of a route service hours or a group of routes. Then we would do a Title VI analysis evaluating whether or not there was disparate impact or disproportionate burden on minority or low-income populations. So this is language that we use from the federal law, the word minority populations. We'll be changing that to be more of an appropriate terminology for our local environment and talking about communities of color and people of color. Next slide. Part of doing this analysis is understanding where populations live. And again, this is a home-based analysis. And so the map on the left shows where communities of color live based on the American Community Survey data. So the blue dots represent 1 dot equals 100 people and where they live. And so you have a little bit different sense of the distribution of this population as compared to ACP 50s, and the same with low income, looking again at the blue dots representing low income. And of course, this map has a much lower density of blue dots, but we will also be recommending some adjustments on the definition of low income to match other regional thresholds as opposed to the federal threshold. Next slide. And for this analysis that we're presenting to you today, which is really an evaluation of what our service is, both in 2019 and to 2020, since it had been such a significant change. And despite the fact that we're under a peacetime emergency, we still wanted to do this analysis. We found that there's no disparate impact to communities of color or low income as far as the change of service goes. And it may be no surprise that when you look at this map, the red areas are census blocks that have experienced 50% or more, or frankly, suspended service in those areas compared to those that had a slight reduction when you compare pre-COVID in 2019 to fall 2020. So that result is that we've focused our service on those communities that are most reliant on transit, those that have a larger remote work option. There have been a number of routes suspended, as Kristen mentioned, and we believe we've got a good outcome from this. So we have more work to do that we'll be evaluating other ways to assess our equity evaluation for service in the coming year, but this concludes our presentation on what we've developed so far. So next slide, and the three of us are happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Adam, Kristen, and Rachel. It was very interesting. Are there questions from council members? Give everyone a chance to have their videos come back on. Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, it's really good to get a presentation on evaluation, because that is the piece that people often forget about when we get so busy. We implement our strategic plan and then go on to the next one. But evaluation is critical for continuous improvement. And good to see, what our challenges are with the pandemic, and we'll be able to, compare in the future against this. And I was also happy to hear that you plan to modify some of the terminology with regards to minority. I noticed throughout the presentation that some of the labels changed, maybe trying to be consistent with the label throughout the document and up to date. Minority is becoming out of date, so you mentioned, people of color, or adding BIPOC. Also, where I saw Black/African American when other labels referred to ethnicity or origin. So want to be consistent there. That's really important, especially as we all try to get on the same page with how we're doing the evaluation. So, you know, we're so used to seeing Black/African American versus African immigrant / African American. So just being cognizant of that. When you, on page 21, you're referring to the BIPOC and low income, and you mentioned that we're going to be looking at that a little bit, the low income portion of the data a little bit differently. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Chambliss, yes, we are looking at adjusting that threshold of what is determined to be low income to be a higher threshold. So you will see a larger population reflected in that to mirror the council threshold as opposed to the federal threshold. And I'll just mention that this is somewhat of a transitional presentation as far as the language goes. While we put this together, we fully are cognizant of the different language changes, but wanted to make sure that as we present this, that the Transportation Committee understands the differences that the FTA and the law shows and how we're making that transition locally. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so is that threshold changing because of the increasing cost of living, or?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Chambliss, we really wanted it to match what the local expectations were for how we define low income. That's really what it comes down to, because the federal threshold is different.
Okay, great, thanks, that makes sense.
All right, additional questions or comments? All right, I've got one then. So of the metrics and stuff that we look at, one thing I know when I would go out to communities and for different community meetings, one of the topics that comes up often is travel time. And is that something that could be looked at from with this lens as well? Or is that, you know, or do we need new data from the travel behavior inventory to get to that? Or I would just like your thoughts on that.
Well, Madam Chair, I'll turn this over to Rachel, but I just wanted to add I think it depends on what aspect we're looking at, and it's probably easier to compare travel time options when you're looking at a corridor or a particular one area to another area versus region wide. But there are different ways to approach it, and so I'll ask Rachel to reflect more on that.
Well, and I'm just one quick thought before I turn it over to Rachel, is that even when you roll back in, if you roll in commuter services, you're going to have a lot of changes in some of that just because part of that's designed to have somebody sit on the bus for a long time. So it could skew your data. Go ahead, Rachel.
Madam Chair, yes, we are definitely looking at additional ways of measuring really how we deliver fast and reliable service. And so on-time performance, what I presented is kind of the classic and industry standard for measuring reliability. But what you speak to is really relevant. We are investigating a couple ways of measuring speed and relative to also auto travel time and seeing if, you know, we know that in most cases, obviously transit does take longer than a personal vehicle, but we don't want to see disparities based on race on those discrepancies. And so that's kind of the area that we are investigating and exploring further. And once we have a methodology that's sound and something that we know is repeatable and reviewed by others, we could bring that type of analysis forward. It isn't necessarily waiting on, it's more trying to figure out the best method, not necessarily waiting for another data set to come in.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. All right, I'll give out one last shout out. And if any other council members have comments or questions? All right, well, thank you all. This was really interesting. It's really helpful, actually. So, all right, that would conclude all of our work for this evening then. So if there's nothing from council members, then we can be adjourned. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.